This video is for paper 3, Ideologies, Liberalism. It's the first of two modern liberals in terms of our key thinkers, and that key thinker is John Rawls, an American liberal philosopher in the 20th century. You can see there that he lived from the 1920s until 2002, and his key work is A Theory of Justice, published in 1971. Before we look at Rawls's views on the four key concepts, we'll talk a little bit about the context in which he lived and how, in particular, America had changed from that era of classical and transitional liberalism. What's first of all worth noting is that the first four of our key thinkers have all been born in Britain. However, it's worth noticing that with our American key thinkers for modern liberalism, we need to think about America itself, and the country was founded upon the principles of classical liberalism. It was founded upon the work of liberal thinkers like Thomas Paine. It was founded upon the idea of foundational equality under the law. That's why we get a constitution with separation of powers to avoid the state becoming overly powerful, but also a Bill of Rights laying out the rights of individual citizens. So America was a nation that was founded upon the principles of classical liberalism. However, in Rawls's lifetime, more modern collectivist approaches had been experienced. In the 1930s, we get unprecedented state intervention in the form of the New Deal, where we see the government support individuals and try and enable their potential, improve their lives through state intervention. Now, that faced significant opposition from the Supreme Court, who were trying to judge these laws against the intentions of the Founding Fathers when they wrote the Constitution, but also from the Republican Party, who favoured a much more classically liberal approach, an approach of rugged individualism, of allow individuals to make a success of their own lives without help from the state. But in Rawls's early years, the introduction of the New Deal was setting a precedent for government intervention, government action. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we get the Civil Rights Act of both 1964 and 1968. We also get a Voting Rights Act in 1965. And that legislation is again showing how the state is willing to intervene in order to improve the lives of those more marginalised in society. And so what we're starting to see in America is this growing trend towards state intervention, particularly when we have a Democratic Party president like Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal and Presidents Kennedy and Johnson in the 1960s. So what we're starting to see in America is this redefinition of liberalism in a modern context. So let's look on the next slide at how Rawls views those four key concepts. So first of all, let's look at the role of the state. Now remember, classical liberals are wary of the power of the state, and they're wary of what an overbearing state will be able to do. And so modern liberals like Rawls have a much more positive view of what the government can achieve. And for Rawls, this is linked to the concept of the enabling state. This is the idea that the government can intervene, redistribute wealth, and provide greater equality of opportunity. So progressive taxation levels, the idea that the more you earn, the more taxation you pay, and using that government income to introduce greater government spending, according to Rawls, is a good thing, is a positive. And again, he could sort of look back on the experiences, particularly of the New Deal era, to see the positive impact that the state can have when it invests in its people. And for Rawls, the idea of the enabling state fits with the concept of government by consent. And that is because individuals will realise, using their natural ability of rationalism, that it is better to hand over that responsibility to the state to act in the best interests of society. So for Rawls, the state needs to play an enlarged, an increased, a more deliberate role in the lives of society. And that brings us very nicely onto the concept of society itself. And Rawls is a proponent of social justice. This is the idea that the government and society should both strive towards a fairer society. And for Rawls, that fits with that natural capacity for rational thought. So a just society is one where all individuals, regardless of their position in it, are able to pursue their ambitions and achieve their full potential. But for Rawls, two things need to happen. There are two experiments. The first is the original position. This is the idea that if we were asked as individuals to come together and form a new society, we would choose to live in a fairer one. And that, for Rawls, suggests that more can be done to create that fairer society. However, Rawls identifies that that doesn't always happen, and that's because we are aware of our current position in the existing society. And what we are doing is we are asking individuals to give up their stake in a society which they may be very content with, knowing full well that they may be in imagining this new society surrendering their position for a situation that would leave them worse off. So for Rawls, we need to be behind the veil of ignorance. In order to desire that fairer society, we would have to be ignorant of our stake in the current society. If we are ignorant of our current stake in society, we are far more likely to wish to live in a fairer one. And I usually explain this in class in the form of a bag of sweets, bag of Skittles, anything like that will do, and saying to a group of 6 people, I've got 20 Skittles, one person in this class will get 12, the other 8 will be randomly shared out between the other 5 of you. Now you can choose to stick with it and run the risk of being one of the 5 people that has to share 8 Skittles in the hope of being the one person that gets 12. Or, if you want to live in a fairer society, we'll split them more evenly. Now, it won't be completely equal, because that's not what Rawls intends or desires, but it will be fairer. And most of the time, in that classroom experiment, individuals choose that second option, that fairer distribution of the wealth, which in this case is usually sweets. But because we know our current stake in society, we're less likely, particularly those who are well off in different ways, because privilege comes in all different forms. Privilege isn't just wealth. It could be your social position, it can be your sex, it could be your ethnicity. It's a whole range of factors. Because we're aware of our stake in society, we're less likely to desire that fairer option. But behind a veil of ignorance, we'd be more likely to support it. Moving on now to human nature. So Rawls agrees with that classical liberal principle that we are rational and that we are all born with foundational equality, that there are natural rights and basic liberties. But the big change for Rawls is that we are empathetic. We are outward looking. Now, if we think back to our transitional liberals, I think Mill begins to entertain this notion in the harm principle, and thinking about how our actions can impact the others negatively. T.H. Green, our other transitional liberal, starts to look at this concept of the common good. So transitional liberals begin to think of human beings as outward looking, and Rawls buys into that and argues that yes, we are rational and self-interested, but we're also empathetic. We also want our fellow members of society, our fellow human beings, to succeed. And so for Rawls, this idea of foundational equality, he agrees with that, but he wants to take it further. He wants greater social and economic equality, and those equal rights can be not necessarily just outlined in the form of a constitution, but legislation can help to improve the rights and liberties that we all enjoy. And that's a big change in our human nature. We've gone from the selfish, self-interested views of Locke and classical liberalism, whereas by this point, by the 20th century, modern liberalism, there's this idea that we are empathetic, we care about our fellow human being and their progress and their potential success. Now, this also means a significant change in the modern liberal view on the economy, because the enabling state and this idea of positive liberty, of enabling somebody's potential, the money's got to come from somewhere. And so, again, a significant change from classical liberalism. And neoliberals will look at what modern liberals are suggesting when it comes to the economy and would argue that this is simply socialism diet, that this is a lesser form of socialist economic policy. But for Rawls, the enabling state has to involve itself, there has to be greater public spending, and in order to do so, there needs to be greater progressive taxation. Now, that means that the more an individual earns, the more they pay in tax. And the idea being there is that is where that funding will come from in order to allow greater government spending. Now, the key distinction between modern liberals like Rawls and most socialists is, for Rawls, the gap between rich and poor doesn't necessarily need to narrow. As long as the least well-off in society are getting better off, as long as their lot is improving, then an inequality of outcome is absolutely fine. Because at the end of the day, we're still rational, we're still self-serving, we still sort of chase our own destinies, and there will be naturally differing results in people's wealth outcomes. And for Locke, that was natural and that was to be respected. By the time we get to modern liberals and Rawls, as long as the least well-off are becoming wealthier, then the gap between the rich and the poor doesn't necessarily have to narrow. And that is a significant difference between what many socialists were arguing for and what Rawls is advocating when he's talking about increased taxation and increased government spending.